So the Delta variant makes up about 90% of new COVID cases here in the U.S. Our Nixon Norman tells us more about this mutation and what the issues are that we could face because of it.
We're in an arms race, really, against these evolving variants.
The Delta variant showed up on the scene in April, but remains strong in the fight of infection.
The Delta variant is so good at propagating itself in the community that it's already become the dominant strain in some parts of the world that have actually had very good vaccination coverage.
The first issue with this variant is increased transmission.
Remember that the coronavirus has these spikes that stick out that you see in all the cartoons of the virus. The Delta variant has essentially evolved or changed the composition of those spikes to do a couple of different things. They are better at attaching to the respiratory cells that line your respiratory tract. So that means that they are probably 50 to 90% more contagious.
This mutation is also more dangerous.
With the Delta variant, there are more cases that seem to indicate that you're more likely to get hospitalized or get severely ill.
And has a better chance at fighting against the vaccine.
Seems to be a little bit better at getting around the vaccines that we have. The vaccines still work, but you have to be absolutely sure to get both doses.
The Delta variant may soon replace the Alpha variant, making it the main reason people catch the virus. But health professionals still say the best way to keep yourself safe is to get vaccinated. Putting the Valley first, Nixon Norman, WZDX News.